So, welcome. Thank you for coming to the fourth. Can you guys hear me up there? Is there an echo? I hear an echo, but maybe it's just me. It's okay. Welcome to the fourth and final panel discussion for the Possible Mediums Conference. This has been an amazing discussion across the last 3 days, and I look forward to the final discussion tomorrow. It's been pretty intense, oscillating between looking for tape, finding resources, and keeping the intellectual discussion going. And I found that tremendously rewarding and quite elastic for the mind. So I'm going to begin the excessive volumes panel by first defining the excessive volumes panel features designers who orchestrate depth and calibrate spatial intervals with sharp expertise. They have surpassed an internal discourse of generative computing in favor of a broader focus on the tectonic, optical, and atmospheric effects generated by volumetric modeling. In the context of this panel, I think it is appropriate to first define excessive volumes and volume as a medium. When thinking about excessive volumes as a medium, I think it's important that volume as a medium relies on the qualifier, in this case, excessive, defining the idea of going beyond the usual, necessary, or proper limit, and illustrating qualities of superabundance. I think it is also helpful to define what I mean by volume by contrasting it with mass. On the left, Luigi Moretti creates plaster casts of vast volumetric spaces, namely Roman cathedrals. They highlight the control and possibilities of curated volume. On the right, a contemporary example of excessive volume would be Anish Kapoor's Leviathan in the Grand Palais that was part of Monumenta 2011. Here, the manipulation of volume lands it in the medium category. And transcends its more common role as a result or artifact of the process. Before we dive into deeply, I would like to formally introduce the workshop leaders and panelists that I've selfishly invited here to have this conversation. First, Justin Diles of The Ohio State University. Justin Diles is the Howard E. Lefevre Emerging Practitioner Fellow at the Knowlton School of Architecture for the 2012-13 academic year. His current research centers on the architectural implications of complex structural behavior, particularly failure through vibration and buckling. He previously taught design for 4 years at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna in the masterclass studio of Greg Lynn and in various capacities at the University of Pennsylvania. He has led numerous workshops on contemporary design techniques, most recently at the 2011 Smart Geometry Workshop in Copenhagen. Justin Diles' work balances a calibrated relationship between volume and mass. The work is deliberate and precise as it challenges gravity and redefines enclosure. The projects engage thickness and poche in various ways. Brennan Buck is a critic at the Yale School of Architecture and a partner in the architectural practice FreelandBuck. From 2004 to 2008, he was an assistant professor at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna, teaching in Studio Greg Lynn. He has practiced both landscape architecture and architecture, having worked for Neil Denari Architects and Johnson Mark Lee Associates in Los Angeles. David Freeland, his partner in FreelandBuck, is on the design faculty at the Southern California Institute of Architecture. From 2008 to 2012, he taught at Woodbury University, where he was instrumental in establishing the Fab Lab. Prior to FreelandBuck, David worked with offices such as Michael Maltzon's Architecture and Peter Eisenman Architects in Los Angeles and New York. Brennan and David have won many awards in the short period since starting their office in 2010. The work seeks to translate the qualities of dynamic digital form to the material and physical realm. The work itself exploits contemporary fabrication techniques and employs special effects that produce a result that is smart, refined, and often elegantly colored. Amplification of space through color, pattern, and supple form invigorates spaces with specific character. Articulation of pattern at multiple scales is used as both an organizational device, and design strategy throughout most of their work. Their designs seek to enhance spatial qualities of the space one is occupying and the space beyond. According to their office, patterning suggests regrounding digital architecture in a material world. Michael Young is an architect and educator practicing in New York City, where he is a founding partner of the architectural design studio, Young and Ayata. Their practice is focused on both speculative research and architectural proposals. Michael currently teaches studios and seminars at the Cooper Union, Yale University, and Princeton University. In addition to practice and teaching, Michael is invested in writing and research in relation to the confluence of geometry, representation, and aesthetics. Recently at the Digital Design Theory Symposium, Michael presented on parametrics, painting, and phenomenology. In the work of Michael Young's, the amplification of depth is also apparent, and the impact of optical effects are paramount. The designs consistently evoke a sense of movement and flow that blurs edges, seeks to smooth transitions, and drifts and overlaps in a visually tantalizing manner. The explorations highlighted here in influence and atmospheres are emblematic of the refined modes of representation that is pervasive in all the work, from drawing studies to opera house proposals. Controlled fluctuations of intensity illustrate a honed expertise of volumetric control. The work is subtle, smart, and irresistibly visual. I will quickly offer a very quick contextual survey of sort of the grounding of my interest in volume in the interior. Historically, the relationship between volumetric interiors and the exterior massing has ranged from periods of literal offsets in geometry to fantastical sectional differences. Through the calibration of thickness and depth, the architect curates to what extent the technical necessities of a building correlates with the aesthetic experience. Recent design techniques and the development of technology have resulted in thinner architecture, comprised of many layered surfaces impacting architectural elements such as fenestration, threshold, and surface. In Going Inside Architecture, a tentative synopsis for a history of the interior, Elias Cornell defines the exterior as being designed for preparation, introduction, presentation, and arousing expectancy, while the interior was meant for fundamental uses and experience. The oscillation, another important thing to note that comes up often in the work that we will see today, is the oscillation between tectonic and stereotomic qualities in the work of the panelist. Defining here tectonic as elements whose aspects are primarily constructive, columns, skeleton, structure, and that is stereotomic, which is meant to facilitate the description of something, for example, soaring, suspended, floating, hollowed out, distanceless, with little constructive articulation. The Pantheon is a classic example of a volume used decisively, whereby the atrium before the entrance, now Piazza della Rotonda, collects arriving visitors from the irregular streets and assembles them expectantly before the lofty entrance portico. The portico here provides a tectonic introduction to the stereotomic interior. It has an unconditional suppression of all possible parts under the absolute unity of the whole, an awe-inspiring, overwhelming experience. Minerva Medica, like the Pantheon, is a mass building, but apses exclusive to the interior in the Pantheon here appear on the exterior, thus belonging to the silhouette of the whole. Even though dominated completely from the central part of the building, it is no longer a single architectural element, but several, one major over-towering element and a few smaller ones. Alois Riegel defines this as lateral rooms. Alois Riegel's analysis of the connection of architecture to late Roman art identifies the shift of interior to No longer simple stereometric shapes, the pyramid, cube, prism, cylinder, but they are comprised of several such basic shapes together, one usually dominating the other, and that the special character of space is expressed mainly by the interior, while that of mass composition is of the exterior. Here, an image of Sant'Andrea Mantua by Alberti illustrates a dominant basic shape working together with perpendicular geometric shapes to compose the interior volume. As technology has developed, including the onset of the Industrial Revolution, coinciding with the development of sectional drawings, we can begin to see poche no longer as mass, but rather the contemporary definition of the space between two surfaces. We are now going to skip forward about 200 years into modernism. Here is Mies van der Rohe's Neue National Gallery in Berlin. In a recent seminar, Sylvia Lavin recently stated, "Every major act of modernist architecture was an often thinly veiled attack on the interior. Make it empty, take it outside, dematerialize anything that defines it." As a result, she claims that there is an urgent need to get back inside the box of architecture and discover or insist on and invent the interior's transgressive potential. In modernism, the thin skin was applied to a building, emphasizing its freedom from the structure. The building components were reduced to a minimum of materials, and the facade comprised of pre-assembled components, very tectonic. The skin and structure were visually flattened because of the modular articulation of the facade. Excessive volume thinks that tension and volume should be introduced between the layers. They can appear flat and voluminous, and these diverse effects transition from one to another continuously rather than discretely as panels and frames. This implies the relaxation and elimination of a discrete frame that is infilled in favor of a structural stiffening layer bonded to the other cladding systems. Depth will be designed between the layers and also across the edges. So instead of window-like panels, there are bleeds and fades at corners and edges in terms of transparency and depth. The shift away from a supported thin curtain wall to the voluminous laminated variable thickness and surface allows for the creation of spatial pockets in the depth of the facade. The surfaces can now bulge, distort, and generally amplify the intricate differences between the contours of massing, structure, and skin. I have organized the work of the three panelists in relationship to poche, volume, and calibrated space. Robert Venturi, in Complexity and Contradiction, states that contradiction between inside and the outside may manifest in an unattached lining, which produces an additional space between the lining and the exterior wall. Here in the plan diagram, such layers between the inside space and the outside space can be more or less contrasting in shape, position, pattern, and size. The use of detached layers leaves spaces in between. Do you need? No? Sometimes all layers are closed.
What did you to get a bucket of water?
I have one. You said you would have my back. Hydration is important. We'll go back. Here in the plan diagram, such layers between the inside space and the outside space can be more or less contrasting in shape, position, pattern, and size. The use of detached layers leaves spaces in between. Sometimes all layers are closed and dominate the small space of the center. Such is the case in Louis Kahn's Unitarian Church. The perimeter spaces are referred to as residual spaces, or in some cases, servant spaces. Sometimes these spaces harbor mechanical equipment or alternative ways of occupying. In some cases, the dominant space can be so open that the distinction between dominant and residual space is ambiguous. Residual space that is open might be called open poché. Here in the Ford Foundation by Kevin Roche, in the Grand Atrium, there's a blurring, an intentional blurring of interior and exterior, a blurring of boundaries. In FreelandBuck's installation Slipstream, the work translates a two-dimensional drawing into three-dimensional space, literally filling the space. The project uses precise moves to define volume and employ intricate poché, providing both physical and visual separations, or in their words, both structural and dynamic visual filters between interconnecting spaces. The project alludes to the late Labius Wood's 2010 slipstreaming drawings of flows. In reference to this series, Labius Wood stated, "These drawings are not intended to be definitive, but evocative, a graphic analogy that you have understood in the same spirit. Their purpose is to open the imagination to new spatial possibilities." Here in Michael Young's Hive Lamp, the use of parametric software is explored to determine at what level the variation of cells begin to lose legible repetition and instead achieve other performative and aesthetic effects. The cell variation is tightened in particular locations for structural connections, thickened in others for screening, and scaled in others to deal with the changing surface geometry. The Hive Lamp compresses structure, enclosure, and aperture into a lattice shell that develops visually as a series of lines and implies depth through the shifting of the inner and outer surface, a gradation from open to closed. An example of structural poché is Justin Diles' winning competition entry, Lenticular Field, a remake of the traditional space frame. The project's variegated volume and dramatic shifts in character share an affinity with both lenticular clouds, known for their particular shapes and coloration, and lenticularly printed images that morph animatedly from one state to another. The entire canopy thickens and thins as needed to reshape outdoor rooms and accommodate spans of varying distances. The canopy also irregularly touches the lawn and plinth to form columns that reinforce the spatial layering of the project. Volume, and specifically the space beyond and the space between. In Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax Great Workroom and the Larkin, missing a slide here. In the Larkin Building's Light Court or Central Hall, these buildings are defined by the project of volume. They transcend materiality, typology, and structural methods, although they are intricately connected. In all cases, the mass between the interior dominant void and the exterior shell were negotiated by the perimeter balcony shelves, woven office perimeter, and the spiraling ramp and galleries in the case of the Guggenheim. They are monumental spatial sequences that indicate the mastery of the medium of volume. Stan Allen, in his article, The Guggenheim Refigured, describes how Wright characteristically dissolves the boundary between interior and exterior and creates the space beyond by means of complex internal geometries. In Michael Young's Busan Opera House competition, he develops the traditional perimeter box seating of an opera into hierarchically striated auditorium seating that staggers and compresses to become more intimate, equalitarian, and experiential. Another project that invests an abundance of design capital and poché in the space in between is Justin Diles' competition entry for MoCA, Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art in Brooklyn. The illuminated acrylic ceiling and column sheathing acts to both attract people up and into the building and to subdivide space. The illuminated surface blushes and alludes to the space beyond. FreelandBuck's woodlot house in Portland, Maine is designed as 6 volumes and 2 courtyards that strike a precise balance between solid and void. Neither a carved solid nor aggregate volumes within a continuous void. The interior rooms and exterior courtyards are both continuous, but meet only at their upper and lower corners. There is a deliberate alteration of mass and void. This research continues into the Disaster Prevention Center project, or competition project in Istanbul. Here, the exhibit rooms take the form of boulders, as the office calls them, with a single central space at the core surrounded by a ring of infrastructural crochet and circulation space. The final means to look at the work is through calibrated and vectoral space. Michael Young's Involutes and Atmospheres is an exploration that developed from Michael's analytical thesis work of St. Ivo, and as he puts it, a frustration of the lack and type of drawings that existed for this project. These explorations, in his own words, have to do with sensations of depth, movement, speed, intensity, and the vibrations of moire effects that occur as the systems of lines drift and overlap. Well, in the Busan Opera House project, while most of the work that I have shown up until now is of small and medium scale, Michael's competition entry for the Busan Opera House is a dramatic display of curated volumes at a much larger scale. They make the progression to the stage a dramatic event. They put importance on the promenade of foyer and circulation, and in terms of a mediating space for the participatory act of in anticipation of the congregation. Finally, FreelandBuck's The Catenary Whirl is a canopy project that also uses vectoral qualities in the medium of drawings in its volumetric translation to invigorate a new set of spatial effects through the use of multiple vectors that erode the clarity of the boundary from one atmospheric condition to another. The use of undulating surfaces is a recurring tactic for subdivision of space and compression and expansion of volume. Okay. I now would like to take the opportunity to let the panelists engage and talk about their work and the collection of their work within the context of the excessive volumes panel. I think one of the first questions that I have is related to intricacy. I think in a lot of the work there's a range. The work consists of expansive surfaces and volumes, but is also accompanied by the smallness in detail in many cases. And I would just wonder how, in the various projects, how you manage the calibration between the two, the calibration between sort of expansive qualities of the volume and the sort of intricacy of the details. I guess particularly even in the last project in the Catenary Whirl, I mean, it's the detail I think becomes pretty important. Or in Justin's case, in the lenticular field, you said that you were fascinated by the intricate qualities that can be elicited from these systems when the combination of form, color, and surface begin to work together.
I can start. I just want to say I like the presentation, and I think that the two words that are the name of this panel are good ones and maybe fairly accurate in terms of our interests and our work. And I think you could say that we're interested in space, but space is a modern concept that's about continuity and extension and evenness, and I think we're much more interested in space that's formed and space that's related to form in the way that it's been talked about and worked on for the last couple of decades, and so I think volume is probably the right way to talk about that sort of very tight relationship between form and what's around in between form. And then I think excessive, I've heard talked a lot about in terms of it as a technique to produce atmosphere, less so in relationship to volume and space, but I think a lot of our interest in the ambiguity between form and volume, I think requires a multiplicity and requires repetition and variation, and so in that sense I think just many volumes have an effect that one volume can't. So I like that. I think that spatially our interest is really in trying to think about relationships between inside and out and solid and void in a less transparent way, but in a still very intricately connected way, in an ambiguous way. And so I think the detail has something to do with that translates for us to a smaller scale in the canopy stuff or the fabrication and pattern work in terms of ambiguity of scale and the fineness of the toolpath or the line and how that works at multiple scales and reads sort of at the scale of whole and the scale of the detail. So I think for me there's a relationship there between ideas about repetition of spaces and volumes, I should say volumes, not spaces, and the fineness of detail in our pattern work at a smaller scale.
I guess in my case, in the Canopy project that you mentioned, I was trying to work through how you could produce, I guess, some idea of poché or thickness, which typically gets enclosed between two surfaces with, I guess, thousands of little lines, like linear elements, which would be the structure. And it was a way of working through, I guess, some of the things that were going on in the studio in Vienna at the time, talking about poché and thickness and a kind of like almost juicy or succulent surface that would happen between the interior volumes and the exterior surface of the building. And trying to relate that back to studying with Cecil Ballman, and also, as importantly, being exposed to the models of Le Ricolet at the University of Pennsylvania, which are really incredibly beautiful and intricate, but are all composed of space frame elements, so tension and compression elements. They sort of scale up into these really suggestive volumes, but I was, at least with that project, working through how you could push that even further so that you would start to get thick hovering figures appearing, which would be produced only by the kind of multiplication of like these linear elements. In that case, I also introduced like these mylar sails to kind of reinforce that, because I found that it's actually difficult to produce that. I think that some of the Michael's drawings and Dave and Brennan's projects do that really, really well. And it's something that I'm continuing to work through in my work.
Should I say something too?
Sure.
One of my favorite architects is this guy by the name of Santini Michel, this very strange gentleman practicing in South Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, and he produces this monster hybrid, the Baroque Gothic, and it's these psychotic, William Oranger's Ceaseless Melody of the Northern Line drifted into the volumes of the Baroque. And this sort of weird hybrid condition between the Gothic tracery, but it's no longer tracing just the volumetric surfaces of that, of those spatial interiors, produces a kind of an incredible combination of grotesque and elegant effects, and in many ways having kind of been inspired at a certain level by those initial drawings were studies of, not these ones, but they come from a study of Santivo, and Santivo is the interior dome of Santivo is one of the most excessively weird tectonic moments that I can possibly imagine. Anyways, we'll leave it at that. The point being is that I think this question has been coming in and out of architecture for quite a while. And the relationship between the intricacy of a surface ornament and the clarity of a spatial definition, and how those things can begin to push and pull at each other in the creation of an aesthetic idea.
Great. Maybe we'll pull you in here. David, I appreciated our conversation last night about poché and the sort of development of it throughout history. And you sort of talked to him at one point saying that in our work we really try to elaborate on the modernism's liberation of poché. I think that's how you were saying it. I don't know if I...
Yeah, I mean, I think I was making a point about the surface being liberated, tectonically liberated, the curtain wall, and the kind of the development of this new transparency and extension out of the building was a kind of liberation of surface, and it's now been kind of delegated by each kind of successive movement and many different architects to take on another set of characteristics or take on another set of roles in the building. And like in relationship, I guess, while modernism in a way kind of evacuate any kind of materiality from the facade, from the surface, at the same time, I think it's interesting to note Alejandro Zarapolo's kind of staking claim to the kind of the envelope as the last vestige of authority of the architect at the same time. And so, I don't know, I think that certainly part of the interest in poché and in surface, at least in our work, is to try reinflate that surface and do so with a sensibility about how the interior and the exterior may be connected, but that there's a kind of maybe distribution of kind of complexity to what may be a kind of envelope or barrier between interior and exterior, and what is a kind of spatial articulation of interior. So I think like in the Istanbul project in particular, there's a deliberate kind of balance. I think you kind of mentioned the main house in this regard as well. There's kind of striking a perfect balance between that which is solid and that which is void. And so part of that is a kind of positioning about the questioning of envelope and the nature of transparency and kind of definition of what we understand as being interior and exterior conditions.
Yeah, maybe there's another, or it's been mentioned, but thinking about the relationship that's in a lot of the projects between tectonics and volume. I was told not to touch the table. I mean, for Ken Frampton, who redefined tectonics in the way that we tend to think about it now, tectonics were about the architectural frame, not about enclosing volume, not about mass and poché. And so to try to get those two things to work together is maybe I don't know if that's something that we're working on. I'm not sure we're totally clear on how those two things relate, but I think those are two things that would have traditionally been opposed to each other, and maybe are, maybe there's some uncertain territory about how those things come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought that's why it was sort of important to relook at the idea of tectonic and stereotomic, because I think in all of your work, it's not moving in one direction or the other. It's about the oscillation between the two. That it's not, you know. I mean, I showed the Anish Kapoor's installation, and I think that is almost zero tectonic and almost all stereotomic, and I think that it's pretty interesting in all of your work. I think how it oscillates between the two. But, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to weigh in on the idea of intricacy, because I think that, and maybe its relationship to excessiveness, I think they're slightly different. I think that intricacy, on the one hand, the way it was introduced into architecture recently, of course, had a sort of visual and aesthetic aspect to it, but I think there was also relating architecture to nature in a specific way. There was it implied an idea about architecture as a sort of ecology and behaving along the lines of natural models. And I think the idea of excessive is related to intricacy, but it doesn't necessarily carry the same let's say natural systems baggage with it or implication with it. But they both, I think, as they are working in architecture now, relate not only to the kind of philosophical things that have been happening in the discourse, but also just the ability the computers have given us to coordinate tons of stuff. It's like you can make projects out of really simple planes, and you can also make projects coordinating thousands of elements. And you have that spectrum, and every day when you design something now, you have to decide how you're going to engage with it, because it's there. That the ability to go excessive is always there. So.
I think I want to open it up to questions, but I think just one last thing to the panel, which I think might lead into questions, based on how the discussions have ended in the last couple panel discussions, and that is this idea of, we didn't necessarily plan it this way, but I think the 4 panels sort of bookended with figural projections, which I think has a huge base in sort of the tradition of architecture, and ending with excessive volumes, which certainly I think also has a huge contextual background. And then in between, the two that Kyle was talking about, we don't necessarily have or someone was saying about the alibi, we don't have, we're still developing that. And so I think that in this group, the question of innovation, right? Because how do you make sure that it's not that it's still moving forward, and that you're taking space making things from precedent and building upon them, if you will, standing on the shoulders of projects before. And I think in this panel discussion, the projects are doing that a bit more than at least the previous 2 panels.
Referring to precedent, you mean?
Yeah, and just I think you have to be cognizant of what you're innovating in that. I mean, I think the flight patterns workshop is a really great example, sort of coming in and saying we want to, we're challenging the sort of tetrahedron space frame model, and then you're dialing it up, but in a pretty calibrated way. And I think that's for me that's innovation as opposed to just something completely new. And I think that's maybe interesting to talk about in the dialogue to the previous 2 panels. The idea of something new that you're really working through, and the idea of kind of innovating, which is also developing something.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of us here who have a lineage related to Greg Lynn, and Greg always taught, he's very much interested in technology and innovation, but always in relationship to architectural precedent, and I think that's true for us. And I was, but that's not true for everybody, and I think I was talking to Pablo Lorenzo Aroa in New York about this, and he's very much concerned about the notion of progress as an ever forward-marching idea, and that's very tricky, essentially, and the idea of innovation being related to progress is something that you actually might want to question, and the automatic acceptance of technology and all of those things come into play. I guess in response to that, was sort of thinking about it, and I think about it a little bit more as a culture, and a culture with edges, essentially, and I think rather than thinking about it as a forward-marching piece of progress in a single direction, I think about it as sort of being at the edge of that culture and trying to pull it in any number of different directions, which don't really relate to, which there isn't necessarily a value judgment of progress related to that, but I think that you can try to, by precedent is what might tie you to the culture, but still allow you to pull it in one direction or another. If you think about a puddle, something like that. That's what we are, in my mind.
We're in a puddle.
We are a puddle.
I mean, I think we could also, again, as we sort of move into questions and we'll start to take them, I think also we discussed over lunch, there's a strong importance put on drawing, I think, in all of your work, and really meticulous drawing. And in many cases, the drawings are actually embedded with the promise of more volume than what the architecture than the architecture itself. And I find that really interesting, this very excessive desire to create depth and volume. And so I think in relationship to, Andrew's here, I think to kind of bring this discussion full circle for the four panels, I think the idea of representation becomes is an interesting thing to talk about in relationship to this work where drawing, again, is being innovated but it's still sort of based in a traditional mode of representation.
Yeah, we work through drawings. That's we rarely build physical models. We work through drawings, digital drawings that we produce. And sometimes those digital drawings are three-dimensional and sometimes they're not. They're two-dimensional, but they're implying depth of a third dimension. And there's a couple things that we think about as we're developing this. One, just in terms of excess, how many lines does it take to turn a drawing into a rendering? Because actually these are renderings. You put enough lines, you begin to lose the drawing distinction, rendering distinction, and you also begin to become clear about the fact that every single thing you look at on a computer screen is a rendering. It's just a rendering of dots that maybe begin to appear linear as a vector. The nature of it is rendering. There's something we've been trying to do recently too, which is looking at the possible mediums as part of this question, because looking at the junctures between mediations which attempt to store information, manipulate information, and transmit information. And the junctures that used to exist when, let's say, you're in the 19th century, you want to transmit a painting. The means to transmit a painting through a book were to move into etching and engraving. Etching and engraving as a mediation of the textures, the tonalities, even colors sometimes of painting, invents a whole new weird world of effects and stylizations of line, in this case, attempting to render surface and attempting to render optical visual effects. And from that you can actually move very quickly into some of the innovations that come from etching and engraving into pointillism, into Bridget Riley, into op art, into questions of the way in which, sensation's a word that's been thrown around a lot through the last several years, but the way in which our eyes are stimulated by the optical information that we've been given. So some of those black and white drawings, we're actually looking at specifically some 17th and 18th century etchers and trying to begin to capture some of the effects, but within now a digital medium, which gives us a completely different control over the intensities and densities of those vectors. It's basically accumulating, aggregating lines until they begin to take on other characters.
I think that for us, the drawing is also quite a bit about bringing a kind of organizational coherence to the work, and is usually a kind of starting point in that sense. And beyond its kind of ability to carry a set or produce a set of effects, allows for a kind of concatenation of form and space that produces, let's say, a kind of translational plane through a project. And so on that's a kind of plane of mediation of many different kinds of forces and many different kinds. And I speak of that not just in terms of vectors, but in terms of the project as it migrates from concept, let's say, through to a kind of tangible or fabricated thing. And so the drawing has the capacity at times in terms of its specificity, but also in terms of a kind of fluidity as well, that it maintains certain kinds of hierarchies and relationships that at times do have to subtly kind of shift or become subtly kind of renegotiated, but the drawing remains as a kind of plane of coherence, I guess.
I'll come back to this idea of innovation, because I think that it's interesting. I think there's a tendency now, maybe just a general cultural tendency, to maybe reflexively like conflate innovation with technology, just because like the kind of economic, I don't know, the economic, before the downturn, the kind of celebrated thing that was happening economically was, you know, all of the kind of booming tech sector companies that were developing. But I think that, and so I think even in architecture, there's a kind of contingency that, or maybe a tendency sometimes to put people who are really obsessed with technology in a kind of, you know, to brand them as innovative. Like if you're bringing a lot of technology, like a lot of firepower into your practice, that it's somehow more innovative. And I think that innovation for me is someone who actually really likes technology, but ultimately loves buildings more than anything else, because that's what attracted me to architecture initially, and that's what I don't want to lose sight of as I engage these other things. I think the way that you kind of critically mediate bringing technology and bring that into your practice to bear on buildings, I guess in my case, thinking about buildings, so, or the possibility of making buildings in new ways or creating new kinds of spaces, to me that's what I defined as innovation, like how you do that critically. Like bring something new into your practice. I mean, in my own case, I think I've been drawn because of my kind of life experiences and my own maybe innate interest to structure as a kind of technology that I find has being brought into architecture in not particularly like satisfactory ways as a kind of, I don't know, disciplinary issue. I mean, in kind of funny ways, like firms like Helmut Jahn, like several years ago, I remember going to his website and seeing the term like archineering. Like he was somehow like celebrating engineering, and then if you look at those projects, there's like lots of structure and lots of structural expression, and so that's how I saw structure being brought into architecture, this kind of celebration of the visibility of the structure. And in my own practice, I think innovation is not necessarily about, in relation to structure, is not about a simple performance agenda, but one that allows the possibility of efficiencies to support unexpected ways that structure can inform space making. So for me, I call that innovation, but it's not about positioning my practice as being the, you know, most, I don't know, the most structurally efficient, or the most structurally exuberant, but it's more about how you can bring that critically into your practice.
Good. Well, I think we still have a bit of time. I'd like to open it up to any questions that we might have from the audience.
Yeah. So I want to keep bringing the things up that have come up before in the segment that you're trying to do, Kristy. I think representation was brought up. The representation was brought up explicitly in relation to how do you draw something that's experiential. I kind of want to make sure that. So I guess this is returning to the representation question again, but paired with experience, aesthetics, and something like sensations. Because I think when it was brought up in the panels yesterday, I think one of Jason's comments about like we just have to take your word for it, and the problem with the picture, which is how Andrew Atwood explained it a little bit later, like how do you get out of the picture? These things which are about experience that don't translate so well to the conventions of drawing. And I think provoking a question of like how do you rethink the mediums that we work through to take on this problem. And I think I'm interested in bringing it up and framing it in that way for you guys, because what's great is that you're interested in producing sensations or some kind of experience, but you work that through the rigor of a kind of digital intricacy project, because that's how you were trained. And I just want to know like a little bit how those two, like I can read into the work how that happens, but maybe to hear you guys talk about how you sort of filter aesthetic concerns, things based in maybe sensibility as opposed to some kind of really clear, logical, formal relationship. Like how do you work that through your practice? How do you make that rigorous? I mean, just that title of your paper, Michael, of the painterly phenomenology, and I can't remember the third term, sounds great, I want to read it, but like, you know, you're not like making watercolor, like Stephen Hall watercolors,
No.
you know?
It's, if you want me to speak specifically about that, the PPP of painting parametrics and phenomenology is specifically that parametrics and phenomenology are bad words that we seldom use in a positive light, at least I seldom use in a positive light because they've been co-opted in a way in terms of architectural discourse. Parametrics by our friend Patrick Schumacher and Revit BIM modeling. Phenomenology by a whole cluster of from Perez Gomez to Norberg Schultz to Glasma. And by and large, the discourse that we have been sharing around sensation is a smuggling of phenomenology through Gilles Deleuze, especially the book on Bacon, into digital discourse. And yet, we are not fessing up to the fact that we're talking about phenomenology all the time. And so, the point I wanted to make with that paper is that we got to find the right ways in which to distinguish what we're doing if it's not phenomenology in the schools of how it's typically understood within architecture. How do we get more and more clear about that? And if it is, then what do we think about that? Because often the phenomenologists and the parametricists are at each other's throats. But if you really put them together, they share the desire that architecture is completely contingent upon something else. And that brings us to where we begin to push back against that sort of contingency. And actually parametrics fits into this too. And you know, when I'm making these drawings, all I'm actually doing with the vectors is every single NURBS curve you draw is a bunch of tangent vectors aggregated and then rendered as a curve and not as vectors. So I'm just turning the vectors on in a very weird sort of way. I'm just turning on all the vectors that control the U and V parameters within a surface, and then trying to figure out what I can drive in terms of an aesthetic from that. So that's what that thing was about.
I mean, it's a potentially productive kind of hybrid between the parametric and phenomenological, because our anxiety about the phenomenological is that it's vague and that it's undefinable.
And that it's anti-technology, as it's been often argued.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think you can see that hybrid a little bit in your drawings, and maybe a little bit in some of the constructions that were shown, where it's all drawing, it's all line work, but the lines start to blur into something, whether it's a set of surfaces or a set of gradient graphic effects. And I think despite that blurring, there's still the specificity of each individual line, and that allows you to then take that line and position it in space and build it. And I think in some of our hanging projects, we're not so much interested in each individual line, but how they aggregate into surfaces that are implied and volumes that are implied. And in the Slipstream project, we were interested in how the buildup of lines in space could be both specific, but also have some of that blurring effect and producing, maybe that's a route toward the phenomenological. I also think that there is a desire there to be able to define it and be precise about what its effects are, and so I think maybe there are multiple sort of outcomes of that hybrid, but I think it's an interesting one.
I mean, one thing that I find really interesting about this work in relation to some of the other panel discussions is the issue of materials and materiality, because I feel like, I mean, when you say in this project, the Hanging Rope project, we were really interested in implied surfaces, right? It sort of suggests that, like, the ropes themselves were not of interest to you. It could have been another material, but the fact that they could hold color was great. I mean, the fact that this is made out of wood is not really like the point, right? It could have been, could be made out of something else. And I think for example, in the tactile objects discussion, the presence of the materials were really critical to the reading of those projects. And I think that that's one, maybe, I think that there's an interested sensation in these projects, but it's a bit amaterial. Maybe it stands closer in relationship to the technology in that respect. Whereas those projects, or that group of projects that we looked at yesterday surrounding tactile objects, is about something else. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be some relationship in terms of a desire for lushness and multiplicity and some of those qualities between our work and some of you guys, but I think there's probably a obsessive I missed the discussion, so I don't know if I'm going to describe things correctly, but I think in our work there's an obsessive idea about, let's say, geometry in space, but very little idea about material and the sort of contingency that material might provide. So I think there is a difference there in my mind.
Or you can say it, and I'll repeat it.
I think I can talk loud enough. So as a landscape architect, I'm really interested in this discussion about this sort of ambiguous tensioning between form or object or traditionally subject and environment and traditionally object, but maybe increasingly subject in these days of another Leviathan, which is, of course, climate, as it relates to environment. And so I'm especially kind of pulling off, Justin, your comments on sort of the material itself. And I was very intrigued in your idea of the juicy membrane that you mentioned earlier. And I was wondering what you're thinking in terms of that sort of tensioning in relation to the actual betweenness condition that is the surface and what that might attain in terms of the contour.
Repeat a little bit of this. There's a hearing issues.
Okay, I think the question was that you're interested in how the discussions have been oscillating between object and subject, and also very interested mostly in your comments about the sort of juicy surface. And I missed the.
I mean, I can redo it.
No. I mean, I think it was mostly about the kind of membrane and that quality and the thickness and how that oscillates and how that, I think, has a different relationship between when that is an object and how it interacts with the subject.
Yeah, that sort of inside-outside tensioning.
Right.
And you mentioned this idea of a juicy membrane.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
very, very interesting in that
I should be careful what I say.
Okay.
Well, I would just say that one of the things that just fascinates me fundamentally about architecture is the necessity of always examining what you're designing, both as something that you can kind of see as a distance from an object, and then something that you go inside of. And I mean, not to sort of pass the buck, so to speak, but I don't know if you were here yesterday, but one of the things that really fascinated me about the tactile objects panel and that body of work was that it started to situate many of those projects were of a certain scale, and all of them tended to inhabit either gallery spaces or the interiors of buildings. And they were a little bit designed like organisms, so they had all these kind of succulent and juicy surfaces. And I thought that in a way another title for that panel discussion could have been what happens when you design architecture as if it were really alive, and kind of looked like it was alive in the way that people are alive, in the way that plants are alive. And I thought that was really interesting. One of the things that I thought was so interesting about the work that we saw yesterday was that it, because it wasn't in most cases at the full scale of the building, but it was larger than a person. It really kind of spoke to this issue that you're talking about. So like these architectural objects, installations, proto-buildings, like inhabited spaces at a scale like maybe 1.5 or twice the size of people. So you can feel kind of either uncomfortable, like there's this like kind of, I don't know what, pig in the space with you, or you could kind of go inside the pig and suddenly that pig becomes a room. And I think that there's certain projects and a certain line of projects definitely that I saw yesterday that are confronting that problem really directly, and I find that really interesting. Though I don't know if that answers your question.
All right, well, yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
As you were talking about representation, I was thinking about a convention that we probably all had to practice at one point, hatch. And I remember, I think we're all old enough that once upon a time we had to sit there and once you start hatching, it's hours.
Have you ever done like the entire ground as a poche and just started hatching? And all of a sudden, like a couple days later.
So we're back to poche and an idea about qualifying a space. We're qualifying an area. And I remember, let's say making a mistake at 3 in the morning, and there's a little blip in the hatch. And so suddenly there is a little space that's created because of this accidental density. And in some ways, when Adam mentioned painterliness and this idea of producing visual spaces or visual volumes or parts, right, qualifiable parts within something that you darken. I'm just kind of making this observation, maybe putting it out on the table, thinking about representation, because in a way, when you're talking about the somewhat irrelevance of materiality, right, we could use a pencil, we could use a pen, but really the medium seems to be the hatch.
There's some interesting questions that are raised about the relationships to our traditional mediations of drawing and our use of computation, because it is true that the nature of the plan in the section as mediators between an architectural idea and a building, or if we want to put it into Robin Evans' world, that is the space of all the weird translations that begin to happen. I think a lot of people actually are working in that space between the drawing representation and then the material artifact, the production of that material artifact. But what I'm trying to get at is that we no longer need the flat plane in order to measure our designs. And that flat plane was absolutely necessary in order to measure through descriptive geometry, through sectioning and projecting architectural information. It was a total necessity. So one of the things that is a curious event with this, we don't need the flat plane anymore for measurement if our measurement is being handled automatically through the differential geometry of our software and is able to actually move quickly into a CAD/CAM manufacturing. Do we still need the flat plane? And my answer is yeah, we do. That actually we need the flat plane more than ever, but for different reasons. It's no longer the necessity of measure, but it's, if we want to get excessive about our volume, it's a lot of the effects that are in excess that are explorations of depth, of character, of materiality, and of the way in which a flat plane can be married and joined with other disciplines. It becomes the kind of cross-disciplinary zone where you can be, there's people that bring in science, there's people that bring in mapping, there's people that bring in cartoons, people that bring in other characterizations that exist within that flat plane, and that space becomes a place in which we begin to make our arguments through representation. So it's, the plan and the section will go on, but they won't be the same thing as they were previously. But I still, by the way, I still teach traditional descriptive geometry methods. There's something necessary to understanding those to be able to position what your work is in the flow of history and to be able to use it to compare and understand what it is that you're up to within a lineage of architectural thought that for many reasons happens in built work, of course, but also happens through, there's just arguments that you can make with a plan that you need to be able to still put together. Whether your building is designed through plan is a totally different question, but anyways, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about old, new, what's changing, how do these mediations shift? There was this symposium at Yale called Is Drawing Dead, which it's actually kind of a silly symposium, actually, when you come down to it, because no one actually poked the right button, no one actually poked the right question. It kind of turned into basically everybody saying, no, drawing's not dead. And that was it.
Just need the markers in your hand.
Anyways, but I think it's changing, and we need to be clear about how it's changing. That's all.
Yeah, and just one quick thing about the hatch. I mean, I think it's an astute observation. There's a kind of clear graphic relationship to a lot of the drawings, and yet hatching was used to clearly differentiate solid and void, and the drawings are really an attempt to do the opposite, and I think there's a direct relationship between how those graphical qualities get translated into the constructions, into the concert hall that kind of gets attenuated out into the lobby, or the roof that is sort of cloud-like, and its definition is unclear. So I think there's maybe it just points to the value of trying to reinvent conventional representation.
Great. Well, I think we have to wrap things up now.
Can I say one more thing? Because I don't know if I'm going to have a public stage tomorrow or not. I want to say something about the conference and its larger thing, since this is the last roundtable. I'm blown away with the work that I've seen all of you guys put forward here. And I'm also blown away with the insanity of the workshops and all the work that the students are doing. And I feel very lucky to be here and to be included as part of this. It's something that I haven't seen in this kind of East Coast thing that I'm in right now, where the young kids are kind of given the support and the position and the space and the resources and asked to just go for it. And what I like about this is, I mean, we're teasing out differences between all our projects, but we're actually at the same time realizing how much we share and how important it is for generations to connect, come together, and begin to push things forward. And you guys the students are, I think, incredibly lucky to be part of it as well. And this is a very rare thing, these kinds of insane 3-day workshops with a bunch of young people throwing out all the ideas that they've been cooking with all the energy that they can. And so we'll see all the results tomorrow. We'll have a different wrap-up speech tomorrow. It'll be a totally different thing, but hey, I just want to say.
Thank you.